A quick word first about Sussex for Europe, who's hosting this evening. We're a cross-party group of local activists, pro-EU activists, formed in 2017. And we're still working on our original aims, which are promoting the closest possible relations with the rest of Europe, promoting the benefits of our EU membership and what the impacts are likely to be of leaving, particularly leaving without a deal, possibly. And we're still promoting public involvement in the democratic process. We've got a very active Facebook page and Twitter. Please take a look if you're interested. So this evening's talk takes place in the midst of a global health crisis that's morphing into a global economic crisis. And it seems less and less possible that Britain can go it alone. And this seems to me to be the biggest challenge of my entire lifetime. And when I look at our politicians, they seem to be some of the smallest people trying to deal with it right now. And above all, I hope, and I think many others do too, that this is going to be a chance for a change to our system, a change for the better. And we don't want to miss out on this opportunity. So lots of us in our local groups have been meeting and discussing, what do we do? What's the best type of action to take? Where do we best put our efforts at this point to take action for a better world? And so that's part of the reason that we've invited Anthony Grayling here this evening, to inspire us and to give us a thought-provoking inspiration of what we need to be doing right now that can help our country and our global situation. So, Anthony, without further ado, I'm passing over to you. And thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you very much indeed for having me, and I very much hope everybody looking in is keeping safe and keeping well. Just mention at the outset that I have a very poor internet connection, so there is a chance that I might break up and the picture will go fuzzy. If it does, I might stop my video because apparently that sometimes helps and makes it possible to be heard without too many interruptions. Well, I want to begin by reminding you of two things. And these two things are very, very important to remember because they provide the background to everything else that we need to do and think about and talk about. The first of them is that we came this close last November to stopping Brexit. If the opposition parties, and especially Mr. Corbyn and the Labour Party, had not agreed to a general election, there is every chance that we would already have had a second referendum on EU membership and that the whole Brexit nightmare would be over. And the reason I say that with some confidence is that 54% of the people who actually voted in the general election in December voted for parties that were either for remaining in the EU or for having a second referendum. And so had there not been a general election, but had we seen a continuation of the hung parliament, and by the way, the hung parliament of the last couple of years, I shall be adverting to that again because I think it is a wonderful illustration of what a democratic parliament should be like. So when I revert to the point, very important point we need to discuss, which is about electoral reform, and all those people who say, oh, well, it will result in hung parliaments and so on, I say, absolutely, what a very good thing that is, because you see Parliament doing the work that it should be doing, making the administration of the day have to make its case for every single measure that it wants to take, and not just getting it through on the rubber stamp of a majority in the House of Commons. And this brings me, therefore, to my second point that I want to remind you of. What happened in the general election in December? As you know, it resulted in an 80-seat majority for the Conservative Party. You also know that that 80-seat majority over all other parties combined was won on the basis of 43% of actual votes cast, which represents just under 29% of the total electorate. But on that basis, on that minority, this administration has 100% of the power in the country because of the doctrine of the sovereignty of Parliament. When you have a very large majority in the House of Commons, the House of Commons is just a rubber stamping mechanism for the administration of the day. And when you consider also that Mr. Johnson and his colleagues required of their candidates in the election that they undertake a pledge to support it at any cost, you will see that the idea of a rubber stamping parliament was right there from the beginning. So remember those two things. We came very close to stopping Brexit, that there is a majority in the country for a second thought at very least, or for remaining in the EU, and that the outcome of the December general election is a stark example of how incredibly undemocratic and unrepresentative our system is. So bear those, because I think the task that we have before us now, which is firstly to continue the argument for our membership of, or at very, very least, a very full association with the EU, that point, the essential fact that we have to reform our constitutional arrangements, and in particular our electoral system. And the big question is, how do we go about doing that? And thirdly, the fact that with a massive Conservative majority in the House of Commons, rubber stamping everything that this administration wants to do, therefore, democratic debate and procedure has to take place outside Parliament. We have to think about how to get to the voices of the people in our country heard, how ideas can be put forward, how debate can happen. And this brings us to the idea of citizens' assemblies and community action, all of which, of course, sounds very exhausting and complicated. But in fact, there are ways of doing it, and I'll talk about that too. So let me begin with the first point. The first point is about our relationship with the EU. The COVID-19 crisis, desperately sad. It's so sad to think of how many tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths have occurred because of the lack of preparation and forethought and the incompetence that has been displayed in this country. How many grieving families there are. It is just dreadful to think about. But it is an example, alas, of the impoverishment of our system. The fact that we just hand over control of all the instruments of state to what, in this instance, at any rate, has turned out to be a rather incompetent people. And the result has been a desperately tragic one. But one thing it has done is it has dramatized the fact that if the transition period is not extended beyond December, now the maximum transition can be 2 years. And we need a minimum of 2 years to try to cushion, to some extent, the effect on our economy of the COVID crisis. In fact, if you think about the worst case scenario from the economy's point of view, and I mention this because the economy is not just an abstraction. The economy is people's jobs, it's families, it's neighborhoods, it's communities, it's high streets, shops closing down, it's the decay of the social fabric. But, you know, just think of any one individual who loses his or her job and what it's like to be that person. So when there's a very negative impact on the economy, this is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are affected in this way. And it is very bad and very destructive. And indeed, in a way, you might argue, given what the duties and responsibilities of government should be in protecting the interests of people, it is an act of terrible negligence. So we've already seen the prospect of Brexit having a bad effect on our economy. A large number of companies have either closed or moved. By the last quarter of last year, our economy was already moving into recession. Investment, both domestically and inward investment from outside the UK, have more or less seized up. And this was all just because of the prospect of Brexit. Now add to that the effect of the COVID crisis. And we have seen that the impact of that is said to have been at least twice as bad as the 2008 financial crash. In fact, people are talking about a 30% slowdown in the economy in the current quarter, the second quarter of this year, with an overall slowdown of 15%, which is about double what happened in 2008. So then add a poorly negotiated or no deal Brexit in December of this year to that. That's a triple whammy. That's 3 body blows to the economy, one after the other, in relatively short order. By any standards, no matter whether you're an ardent Brexiter or an ardent Remainer, the need for a transition is just plain common sense. It's rationality. And we have to make sure that we lobby as hard as we possibly can to get Keir Starmer and the Labour Party to join with all the other opposition parties, the Scottish devolved government, the Welsh devolved government, and Northern Ireland devolved government, and business and trades unions. I've just seen the road haulage industry come out just today or yesterday with an urgent plea to the government to extend the transition. We have to bring as much pressure as we can to try to extend the transition. Now, this is independent of whatever we think extending the transition might do for those of us who would like to remain in the EU. But there is a significant possibility there too, which perhaps we don't want to advertise too loudly and too widely because it will scare the Brexiters. Indeed, I think probably those who are most keen on Brexit, that is to say, the people who really want to get us out of Europe so that we can have a low tax offshore type of economy. This is people like Gove and Rees-Mogg. I mean, not Gove personally, but his handlers, so to speak, Rupert Murdoch. I mean, the people who are really behind the whole Brexit drive. They are very leery about the idea of an extension for the following reason. Supposing there were a 2-year extension. 2 years is a very, 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 very long time in politics. You remember what Harold Macmillan said? 1 week is a long time in politics, and things happen. If there were an extension for 2 years, within those 2 years, there could be another general election, a collapse of this government. I mean, it's teetering as it is at the moment. The second point that I want to make about constitutional reform, or especially electoral reform, might really have gelled and taken form in an electoral pact between the opposition parties to try to bring that about, which would give us a very good prospect of that election being won by that coalition of interest. And therefore, it is not unimaginable that given the experience of COVID, given the change of mind among people about EU, and given the fact that the old politics is dead. Now, the old politics said you can only have a referendum once in a generation. That was the so-called received wisdom. That is dead. That is now gone. Now we're in a situation where we've had so many kicks in the teeth by events since 2016, with what's going on now, that the idea of not going back to revisit these questions and examining them properly and thoroughly on the basis of the experience we're having now, that would be a travesty. That we have to argue for and lobby for. So for those of us who are passionately pro-EU, the idea of an extension offers the possibility of being able to reverse Brexit altogether. But quite apart from that, and so we have to keep these two things separately, quite apart from the chance that extension gives us, from the point of view of the economy, of individual lives, of jobs and communities, an extension is desperately, desperately necessary. Therefore, we must put our energies into this. We must write. We've got to write to our MPs. We've got to harass the heck out of them. And we've got to write to Keir Starmer. I'm hoping that Keir Starmer is a man of reason, and that if enough voices are heard, if a sense of urgency from around the country impacts, then the main problem that he faces, which is internal Labour Party politics. And, well, quite which of Dante's circles of hell that one is, I don't know, probably all of them, but I would imagine there are people on the inside of the Labour Party, in National Executive Committee and on the shadow cabinets and so on who will make life difficult on this particular point, because there are some, as you know, left-wing, far left-wing Brexiters as well. But at any rate, if the voice from the country is loud and clear and persistent and consistent, and we keep on arguing for this, and by the way, it is urgent. Here we are in the middle of May. The extension has to be requested before the end of next month, before the end of June, and therefore there is no time to waste. So the extension matter is really key. And not a 6 months extension, not a, Jeremy Hunt is now talking about asking for a 6 months extension. That's not good enough. The point can be made to Brexiters that if you have an agreed extension of 2 years and by some miracle the heavens open and the most wonderful trade deal drops down and a beautiful relationship takes form, then Brexit can happen before the 2 years. But we need at least to give ourselves the breathing space, which unfortunately is a really horrible metaphor to be using at the moment, but I'm afraid it is the apt metaphor. So that's point number one, the extension. We've got to act, got to write, got to argue, got to meet, got to encourage one another, got to talk to anybody and everybody. Not just writing to your MP and writing to Keir Starmer, but also writing to local businesses. Because if you can get businesses and local trades unions and local organizations to write, if you can get your local health authority to write, and this is important too, to try to activate the community and community groups and interests and so on for the point I want to talk about in a little while, which is community action and citizens' assemblies. I'll come back to that. So that's point number one. Point number two, electoral reform. Well, the need for it speaks for itself. We're in this awful situation now because our constitution, our uncodified constitution, so well described as a set of understandings that nobody understands, has been perched on this very fragile point of the first past the post plurality voting system ever since gradually more and more democracy was eked out after the 1832 Reform Bill. Now, back in the 1870s or 1880s, Sir Leslie Stephen, father of Virginia Woolf, in an essay discussing the concept of the sovereignty of Parliament, pointed out that if Parliament passed a law saying that all blue-eyed babies must be killed, then that would be the law of the land and people would have to comply. But he said, nobody would ever dream of passing such a law. His essay was written exactly 50 years before the Nazis came to power in Germany, when a very close analogue to killing blue-eyed babies became part of state policy and action. Not very long before Stephen wrote that essay, John Stuart Mill, in his book Representative Government, again discussing the sovereignty of Parliament, he said, Parliament, there are no constraints on the power of Parliament. Parliament can do what it likes. Parliament is the sovereign body, not the people, not the voters, not the Crown, but Parliament. Actually, of course, the Crown is part of Parliament. But this unbridled license that Parliament has would never, said Mill, ever be exercised in a killing blue-eyed babies kind of way, because MPs are gentlemen. In other words, Mill was saying that the great constraint on the overweening use of the power of Parliament was that, generally speaking, MPs were well-behaved, sensible fellows, and they would never do anything awful. Well, when you see Parliament stuffed out with people who aren't gentlemen and who aren't particularly rational and who are there because they have a very, very partisan view about what they want to happen in the country, then the unbridled power of Parliament is a danger. And we, in our constitutional arrangements, we have no separation of powers between the administration, the government, and the legislature, Parliament. In fact, the legislature, Parliament, is the creature of the administration, because the administration is drawn from a majority in the legislature, which means that the administration controls it. This is against all constitutional principle, which says that the legislature, popularly elected, is the body that will control and hold to account the executive. But that doesn't happen in our system. Only if you have a hung parliament do we see the legislature holding the administration to account. And we've witnessed that happening over the last couple of years. Some people say, this is what you will get. You have proportional representation. You will get hung parliaments. You will get coalitions. You won't get strong government. Well, I say, I've had enough of strong government. Thank you very much. What I would like to see is a government always having to make its case and get its measures through on their merits, on a case-by-case basis, having to win the argument in Parliament and in the country. And this is the kind of result that would come if we got parliamentary reform. And it seems to me that parliamentary electoral reform is now vital. We cannot continue as we are with two parties vying with one another to get their hands on the levers of power, interests of the faction that mainly supports them, and able to do it on a minority of the vote. This means that politics is a game played by politicians. It's not for the people of the country. It's not in the national interest. In fact, if you think about the very concept of democracy, democracy is for the people. That's all the people. The government is the servant of the people, not its owner or controller, which is what it is at the moment. In fact, in a way, politics really shouldn't be a career. It should be a service. And with the two-party situation we have, and whipping and the party control over MPs, we get a detachment of the whole political and governmental process from the real interests and needs of the country. So electoral reform is key. So how do we get it? Well, we have to persuade, all the opposition parties, and even now the Labour Party, because the Labour Party, you can see there are plenty of people in the Labour Party, and Keir Starmer himself is among them, who see the point about electoral reform. In the ideal, what we would like to get is all the opposition parties agreeing that at very least for the next election, even if it's just for the next election, they go back to all their awful tribalism and quarreling and so on afterwards, but just for the next election, to make common cause on a platform of electoral reform. The logic of this from the Labour Party point of view is that the Labour Party under current conditions is extremely unlikely ever to be able to win a majority in the House of Commons because of Scotland. They've lost Scotland, and unless they were to get Scotland back, they probably won't be able to form a majority government. So if they make common cause with all the other parties, and that Johnson might be our best ally here. My own personal view is he's a complete buffoon and an incompetent charlatan who's been shown up by events. Sentiment, when you look in the last few days at some very right-wing Tory MPs like Mr. Bone and the Telegraph and the Sun and the Daily Mail, all criticising him and criticising the government, you can see that as it is written in scripture, even the will turn. So we can hold out hope that if we could persuade all the opposition groups, that's Labour, Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru, SNP, the Greens, all to work together on a common platform, even if it's just for the next election, in order to get proportional representation. If we could achieve that, and by the way, there's apart from the internal argument in the Labour Party that has to be won, there is a problem, which is that the Labour Party constitution requires the party to field a candidate in every constituency. That clause will have to be suspended for at least the next election, so that they can have a proper electoral pact with the opposition parties who have a real opportunity of winning in a given constituency. Labour would almost certainly be the largest party in that coalition and would be the leading group in any government that resulted. And therefore, they should regard that as being a real opportunity, given that if they don't agree, they're very unlikely to be able to form a government. So we've got to campaign for that. We've got to make the case, put the argument, persuade everybody. We know that the Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid have already agreed. They've already agreed on a pact. So the basis is there. It's getting Labour on board and winning that argument with them. Now, this is something that we cannot delay on either, because our parliaments are 5 years. No government is going to run to the full extent of 5 years of a parliament before an election. In normal circumstances, you might very well expect an election to occur 4 years after the previous election. So that means that the next election is about 3.5 years away. But in these very unusual circumstances, difficult circumstances, and with a government of the no talents and all the difficulties that it's got itself into, it is not impossible that an election might come sooner than that. That means that we can think of ourselves as having something in the region of 2.5 years in which to fashion that coalition for electoral reform. And since this takes work and it takes argument, takes organization, takes a lot of continual pressure, keeping up the pressure, keeping argument going, that means we've got to start doing that right now. So electoral reform, that's another huge issue, and we've got to get on with it now and have a very, very clear-minded view about how that can be achieved. And then the third and final point I want to make, and by the way, Elizabeth very astutely at the just before we all went live on this, put a finger on all these these 3 points. And the third point is associated with the fact that we have a dead zombie parliament. Ever brilliantly, Keir Starmer does cues at Prime Minister's questions. And we're now seeing that without a baying mob at his back, Boris Johnson's theatricals are empty. And he's been having rings run around him by Keir Starmer at the moment. And quite a talented bunch of people on the shadow bench as well, which means that when other ministers, and do remember that the Conservative Party managed to shed most of its talent at the last election, people like Dominic Grieve and others. So we have a parliament where even if Keir Starmer and Jess Phillips and all those people do make life very uncomfortable for the current Conservative administration, it's not going to have any effect. The fate of the country is not going to be altered by it because of this massive majority that the Conservative government has. So from that point of view, effectively, Parliament is a hot air shop. It's a zombie Parliament because of this massive majority. So democratic discussion, democratic ideas, the venting and articulation of anxieties and needs and interests in the country has to come from us, from the people. How do we do that? This is where the idea of citizens' assemblies comes in. Now, if you look up Citizens' Assembly on the internet, you are immediately going to get by the way, I'm going to jump in there because a very, very good question has just been asked about electoral reform. And the question is very, very apropos because, we've been run on the basis not of logic, but of slogans in the last few years, 3-word slogans. And everybody makes the point that, most people, as Bertrand Russell famously said, you all know this, he said most people rather die than think, and most people do. And so it's all about emotion and it's all about, quick phrases. Well, what is the slogan that we can come up with for electoral reform? Or whatever it is, it's got to be short and punchy, but it's got to be it's got to be predicated on the idea that our voting system is unfair. It's unfair. We pride ourselves as Brits on caring about fairness. And yet, if you cast a vote for a losing candidate, your vote is empty. It means nothing. You have no representation. And you can use the following example. A constituency of 100 voters with 10 candidates standing, 8 of whom get 10 votes each, 1 of whom gets 9 votes, and the last of whom gets 11 votes. And it is the one with 11 votes who goes to Parliament. That's our system. 89 people utterly unrepresented, and that person goes to Parliament and makes the laws on the basis of a minority of the constituency. It's unfair. It's an unjust, undemocratic system. I think the word undemocratic probably has too many syllables in it for the purposes of a slogan for most people. So unfair. It's an unfair system, and we've got to hammer that home. So that was a very, very good question. Right, back to the question of citizens' assemblies. As I say, look them up on the internet, and they look horribly complicated and horribly expensive. But they don't have to be. A citizens' assembly can be organized on a local basis. They can be small local citizen assemblies, or they can be large regional ones. And I think if we encourage the formation of informal local groups of citizens coming together to discuss and to talk in a way that I'll just outline, because of course these things should be organic and people should organize them themselves, but there is a kind of structure one can have. If there were local informal assemblies of citizens, then the idea of more organized citizens' assemblies and regional citizens' assemblies would grow out of them. And there are at least two organizations, to my knowledge, who are putting together plans and funding to support citizens' assemblies. That they haven't gone public yet. As soon as they do, we've got to let everybody know about them. So there are real possibilities here of having a major thrust on the Citizens' Assembly front. But let's not wait for that. Let's not wait for the funding to be put together in the organization. A local community, or a set of villages, Hurst, Pierpoint, and all around the Weald of Sussex. So you can imagine getting people together there. One of the coastal towns, and you do it as follows. You invite both individuals and, more importantly, groups. So civil society organizations, local groups, the trades unions, the Women's Institute, the union at the medical union at the local National Health Trust, or whatever it might be. Not on party lines, but on lines of people who are interested and people who have a group, a civil society organization connection, so that voices, points of view, experiences from different aspects of the community can come together. Any group of such people who do get together need to nominate somebody to be the speaker, the chair for the evening, and everybody has to agree that the contributions will be short, to the point, and polite. Because we all know what it's like, how things can easily get out of hand. Some people want to harangue, personalities arise, differences of opinion become heated. And the idea is not to make decisions and pass resolutions, but to come up with advisory points. There may be an agreement that something should be communicated, as it might be to the local authorities or to the local MP or to government. But there should be this opportunity for people to say what is troubling them, to say what they think they need, to give expression to anxieties and desires, which at the moment, of course, between elections, every 4 or 5 years, every 4 years usually, you have politicians coming and pretending to be interested in what people have to say at the hustings. And in between, people don't have a voice. People aren't heard unless they write, or unless they happen to be interviewed by the BBC on the street corner. But these opportunities, even informal citizen assemblies, are opportunities for points of view to be articulated. And this is where local media, local press, the local BBC, or even a newsletter put together by people helping to organize the local assemblies, can get these points made and the major topics that were discussed out there. Get it into the record. Have a Facebook page. Have a web presence in which these debates and discussions and the points raised can be registered. Now, I think this is very important, because the more this bubbles up, the more it provides a basis for more organized citizens' assemblies. And citizens' assemblies can be a very powerful locus of continuing and continuous democratic engagement. We need much, much more participation. We need the political parties to feel that they no longer are the gatekeepers of decision making and of policy making. I mean, we've seen how we've been taken hostage by the following, which is that two main political parties or three main political parties every 4 years offers us a take it or leave it package, a manifesto. And we can't deconstruct the manifesto and say, well, we don't want this, but we do want that, and this is nonsense, and that's a good idea. It's take it or leave it. And as you know, with the fact that your vote may not count at all, that an individual vote seems to make no difference. In fact, of course, if you happen to live in a key constituency, a very, very few votes do make the difference. You know, the astonishing fact about our electoral system is that in 2017, when Theresa May went to the country and she lost her majority, she did so because she had 330,000 votes fewer than Boris Johnson's party got in December last year, which gave him an 80-seat majority. That is how extreme the swings are in our system, how incredibly vulnerable it is to very small number of votes in particular areas. But if you're not in that key area, then your vote, if it's for a losing candidate, is, as I say, unrepresented. So every 4 years, we're offered a package, and between those events, we have too little to say. That must change. That must change. So there are the 3 points. Remember how close we came. Remember how, in fact, we do have a majority in this country that either wants to be in the EU or would like to have another say. We have a majority. You may remember that on the 18th of January in the year 2019, if nothing else had changed in the country, if nobody had changed their minds about Europe, if no impact on the economy had appeared, on that day, enough people would have turned 18 and enough other people would have passed on to the great, whatever it is in the sky, that the demographics of the country had changed it into a Remain majority country. This was worked out by Peter Kellner, the psephologist, on that date, 18th of January 2019. The young people in our country are overwhelmingly in favor of EU membership. That is a fact that we must not let go of. We've got to foster that. We've got to keep it. They want those rights and freedoms and opportunities. They want to be able to travel and work all over and fall in love with lovely French girls and Italian men and so on. They want those opportunities, and we've got to keep that energy alive and give people hope. You give people hope by saying, all bets are off. This is no longer the old-fashioned political situation where we don't have referendums except every generation. Things have changed now. We want to take control. And here is the ideal scenario. We get that coalition for constitutional electoral reform. We get electoral reform. We get a parliament elected on that basis. That parliament will be almost certainly one that will want to revisit the question about EU membership. On the most optimistic view, but it's a realistic view, I think that this whole Brexit nightmare could be behind us somewhere between 5 and 8 years' time. But we've got to put the energy in. We've got to work hard. We've got to make the case for Europe. We've got to make the case for being a leading part of building what is the most imaginative and remarkable effort at international unity, cooperation, progress, sharing, a project which is an entirely new way for the world to organize itself. The United States of America and China are old-fashioned 19th century countries that believe that economic power is for military power, and military power is what gives you your international standing. The EU thinks very differently about these things, and we need to be part of that story. That is the future, and we mustn't allow ourselves to slip right the way back down to the bottom of the historical well, which is what the Brexiters want us to do. So there's my rant. There's my suggestion. So I think we should have hope, because if we were to work at this, we may achieve what we want to achieve.
Thank you so much for that. You can hear the applause reverberating through the internet. Thank you so much for giving us that encouragement and hope, really from a very strong place, and for going through those points so clearly and giving us some ideas, many ideas for action to take forward. And much as we'd like to go into all of them in a lot of detail, we've got questions coming in on all three areas, on the extension to the Brexit transition period, on the campaign for electoral reform, and I think also on citizens' assemblies. So if I can just start by raising the economic questions that have been raised about how do we make an economic case strongly enough to the government to extend the transition period when we think it's part of its negotiation tactics to push everything to the deadline of a no deal and the threat of that, and also any harm that does happen if we were to leave the EU without a deal after December might be conflated with the COVID-19 and therefore hidden. How do we separate those harms? And if I can just add a last one on that is, and what about what do you say to the theory that why don't we just wait for Brexit to happen for it to be the worst possible case, and that will give us the arguments for rejoining?
Well, on that last point, I think the cost that will be borne by individuals and families, and it's very difficult. You know, if you think about what happened in the early 80s when so much of our manufacturing industry was just allowed to go, and how whole communities up in the north, I mean, you know, we're now living with the long-term consequences of places in the Midlands and North which were devastated by losing the main source of employment. Shops closing down, shuttering up, you know, dead high streets, most people unemployed, hanging around the street corners or, you know, at the pub. Awful for the people, the communities, the young people. The example it sets it's just so draining and exhausting to be in that deprived state. So I think whatever we do, we should try to avoid those sorts of harms to people, even though, as you say, it might play into our pro-EU interests to let people see what Brexit really means. But there were two other points in what you said there. One is trying to use COVID to mask the deleterious effects of Brexit. Of course, the Brexiteers are going to try to do that, and we mustn't let them. So this is something, you know, we've got to talk about being alert. This is the virus, that one of the viruses that we've got to be alert about, which is the you know, making excuses, looking for any fig leaf to cover up what's going to happen. Fortunately, this point is already out there in the debate. It's something which has been written about in the mainstream media. It's out there in social media space. So people are aware of the fact that efforts are going to be made to use that as an excuse. So they definitely will. But the idea that brinkmanship is the name of the game at the moment, that the British government are trying to force the EU into making concessions. What the British negotiators surely realize, now I use the word surely there, one of the visiting professors at my college, Daniel Dennett, comes every year to give some talks to my undergraduates. And the first thing he says to them is that whenever you're considering an argument, if the word surely occurs in the argument, you know that's the weakest point in the argument. You're trying to persuade people to, oh, surely, you know. But in this particular instance, I think it cannot be otherwise than that the people negotiating on behalf of the British government with our EU partners will know that the EU is 27 nations with their rules and arrangements, and they're not going to want to break them because some, you know, rebellious, mischievous, self-seeking, blundering group of people want not to pay the club dues, not to be a member of the club, but still to swim in the swimming pool and use the tennis court. You know, they're going to say, look, you're a third country, and you're going to have to suck that up. You're going to have to accept it. Earlier on, now I should just mention that the sort of degree of assurance with which I'm saying this arises from the fact that I have the very interesting privilege of being the chairman of the group of main Remain organizations in the UK. And we meet on a regular basis, and we continue to meet because at the moment also we're trying to coordinate the extension getting activity as well. But in that group, there are people who really know things from the inside. There are people who were MEPs and people in the civil service. Well, one of the members of the group is the person who wrote the Lisbon Treaty. So we have quite an authoritative bunch of people there. And the word that is coming out of Brussels and Luxembourg and from the inner circles is that the EU have discounted a no-deal Brexit. They've said it's not impossible that the British government will crash out. They're making unreasonable demands, that they may just will crash out without a deal and will therefore have to accept third country status and the tariffs that go along with that. How this is going to work with the Irish Sea border and so on, because no preparations have been made. I mean, if we think there have been no preparations for COVID, well, nothing has been done at all about the tremendous difficulty of intra-UK trade. But they're discounting for that in case it happens. That's part of their preparations, because they've been very careful and rather well organized all along. So I think the idea that the British can play this brinkmanship trick and force the EU to do what it wants before the end of December is a dud. It's not going to happen. And between now and the end of June, a decision is going to have to be made by the Leave campaign, which, as you know, now squats at number 10 Downing Street, literally. I mean, all the leading figures of the Leave campaign are all now in Downing Street. Johnson and Cummings's friends who are all there now. They're going to have to make a decision. And is that decision going to be, their own skins or dogma? Because their own skins will be on the line if a no-deal Brexit or a hard Brexit really does treble or quadruple the harm already being done by the prospect of Brexit and by COVID. I see, by the way, that I'm beginning to melt into a sort of inspissated gloom here, so I'm just going to try and put on a light and see if that makes a difference. Hold on. Is that a little better?
Thank you very much for that, Anthony. And I think we will move now to the next set of subjects, which is on the electoral reform issue. And we've got a couple of questions coming in. One which I feel particularly strongly about is, how do we get non-politically motivated people to get excited about taking action on electoral reform? And the second part of that question is, what are we going to do to convince the leadership of the opposition parties to put tribalism to one side? We know there are moves to try to approach Labour, and there's a campaign, Make Votes Matter, which is specifically one of its targets is to try to persuade the Labour Party. And I know they've been in touch with our local Labour Party here in Wealden. So your thoughts, please, on that.
Yeah, very, very good. Well, on the second point, I'm pretty sure that if we were to achieve electoral reform, that tribalism would, to a significant degree, wither on the vine, because there would have to be compromise and discussion, and parties would have to be working together, and it would make some sort of a difference. But that's after the event. How do we get them to stop being tribalist enough now in order to get that result? Well, obviously, argument, persuasion, demand, request, exhortation, all those things, if we keep them going. And this, by the way, relates to your first question as well, about how do we get people, most of whom are very, supine when it comes to activism and political matters, how do we get them energized into doing something here? Well, in both these cases, let us remember what advertisers know, which is that you have to get a message in front of people's minds at least 7 times before they even notice it. This is why you have such terrible irritation when you're on the internet and all these adverts keep popping up and so on. It's because they're trying to get them under your nose at least 7 times before you even notice their existence. They're pleased even if you're annoyed by them, because then you've noticed them. So that's something. What does this tell us? This tells us persistence. You've got to keep pressing. You've got to keep communicating the great importance of these things and how passionately one feels about them. But it's also important to try to engage with people in a way that will make sense to them. So, you can go up to somebody in the street and you can tell them about the tremendous importance of the argument in the Kant's critique of pure reason about the transcendental deduction, and they will look at you as if you're stark staring mad and not be in the slightest interested. But if you go up to them and you say, did you know that you're going to be affected by this, you personally and your family? There was something in social media just today which made me laugh because it is so true. It's one of those things where if you don't laugh, you cry. And that is that what's happening at the moment in the country and what's happening with the government and the looming prospect of even worse disaster with Brexit coming and so on has not got people out on the streets en masse, tearing down the barricades. But what is getting them exercised is that they're being told to stay at home and sit on their sofa. So it's the kind of thing that gets people going is what personally impacts them. So reaching out to people, making them understand that this is personal. The political is personal. What happens in our country, what happens to our neighbors, what happens to people we know, to our children, to all those little young kids in kindergarten today, what kind of country in just 15, 20 years' time? Because my word, I think about all my colleagues who've had babies, and then I think the babies are still babies, and they're all at university suddenly. It's time flashes by, and these things have consequences. And so when we think about future generations, it's a very real thing. So there are lots of different ways that one could try to grab hold of people and get them interested enough to understand that these things matter.
Thank you so much for that. And I think it seems to me to be very true about the impacts of COVID-19 on our society, because that really has affected almost everybody in some way or another, and much more so than Brexit, which seemed to be, for a lot of people over there, Europe wasn't on their doorstep in the same way. So perhaps that gives us hope as well for being able to reach out to people and have political conversations with them in the future.
Yeah.
And so
I think that's because it's a very good point, that actually, because 10 years of attrition on the NHS, it's not a conspiracy theory to say that part of the motivation there might have been to prepare it for privatization or for more parts of it to be privatized. And now, of course, there is the very real risk. We see a trade deal being discussed with the United States in secret, not to be published for a number of years, a trade deal which gives the United States, but not us, an out if they don't like something that we do, and which almost certainly a very, very predatory, extremely well-funded and powerful health lobby, private health provision lobby in the United States of America will be looking with salivating jaws at the National Health Service here. And we know, it's just common sense really, that the way to make a nationalized service ready for privatization is to run it down, because then it's cheaper for the privateers to buy it. It's in need of being bought. The public sentiment will accept it because it wants something better. So this is a real risk. Well, so this is one point, given everything that we've seen with the COVID crisis, that we could focus on in talking to people about the great importance of them getting involved.
Thank you. Thanks. That's a great point to bring to people. Absolutely. And we've had a couple of questions finally about citizens' assemblies. And they're both sort of along the same lines of how this is a new concept at local and regional level, at any rate. We've got an example of it in the climate change at national level. But how would you advise us to interest these local civil society groups to come together to spend time talking when there isn't an immediate result, that they can take forwards? They might debate and they might agree that everything has to be done with wind and solar energy in their local area, but they don't have a majority on the council or whatever. And we have actually somebody from Wales asking a similar thing, saying they've had a lot of difficulty spreading the benefits of devolution, and it's very difficult to stand out against the big news organisations, the Johnson megaphone, he calls it, and the well-funded status quo organisations, and start to move into something new. So perhaps we are all ready for a change. Perhaps there will be more enthusiasm, but at the minute, I'm sensing a bit of hesitation about how we would embark on that.
Yes, I completely sympathise with that, because when these things don't exist and there's no tradition of them, and how to organise it and whether it would have any effect and so on, you can think of so many reasons why it's going to be hard to do and pointless to do, that it's exactly why these things just never get done. This is why I say, in order for something to exist, it must already exist. I'll give you my own experience of founding a college, okay? Now, I often say to people that I had two absolutely undefeatable things on my side when I started this. One was enthusiasm and the other was ignorance. And if the ignorance was the most important part, because if I'd had any sense of what it was going to involve over the coming years, I might have really thought about 20 times, not twice, about doing it. But the one thing I learned is that if you want to create something and make something happen, you have to have made it happen already. It sounds paradoxical, but it's true. So the way to get a citizens' assembly in Sussex is for local community groups such as yours to invite some people from some other local groups to get together over a cup of coffee, or now I'm now on Zoom, to discuss the possibility of getting together to do something like this. Little baby steps first. Get some connections made, talk about the possibilities, talk about the benefits that might flow from them in the ideal, have a target, a goal, and think of something, an issue or a couple of local issues that the discussion might revolve upon, and build it up that way, brick by brick. It's Lego, get started. But if citizens groups start to come together, then it's a basis. It's the building blocks for the thing that we're really hoping will happen. Because it's not impossible that over the next year or two, we might see proper, fully formed citizens' assemblies coming into existence in the major cities and in different regions. So a bit like Martin Luther King, I have a dream, and my dream is that in Newcastle, in Leeds, in Sheffield, in Manchester, in Birmingham, in Bristol, not with all the elite types in London and the southeast, but around the country, and in Wales and in Scotland, groups of citizens come together to discuss, to debate, to tell their local MPs, to tell government, tell the local press, this is what we people coming together and talking, think about the current situation. This is what we need here and what we need for the nation. This is an expression, an articulation of feeling in our communities. So important to do it. Your group and a climate change group and a support the NHS group are, sort of one cause groups. But if you can get all those groups together, talk about commonalities and talk about the larger issues, this begins to take on a slightly different complexion. It takes energy and it takes commitment. It takes a certain sense of kind of grown-upness, really, on the part of people who take part to make this a community thing and not a party political thing or a partisan thing. But it can be done, and anything that can be done should be done. And by the way, in anything to do with politics and society, what one notices this. Think about Parliament. I mean, Parliament is a building, yes, but Parliament, the institution, is not a building. It's an abstraction. It exists because enough of us agree that it should, and we are happy to sort of take part in the processes and activities and consensus that makes it exist. If 60% of the country, or 80 or 90% of the country, decided that they just didn't bother with Parliament anymore, it would just vanish like a soap bubble just popping, because it's an abstraction. Now, the reverse of this is, if you can make something possible, if you can make the idea of rejoining the EU sometime in the next 5-6 years, if you can make that idea possible, then anything that can be made possible can be made actual. That is the thing that makes it worthwhile to put the effort and the energy into something. Certainly in the case of our future, because I believe firmly that the future of the component nations of the United Kingdom as it is at the moment, it may not be in quite this form for very long, but anyway, the UK or its component nations will be part of Europe. Absolutely no doubt about that. The one reason why I don't want to be a victim or a vector for this horrible coronavirus is because I would like to hang around and see that happen. But it's not going to happen automatically. We've got to be part of the story. We've got to put our energies into it to make that possible, so that the possible can become actual. And that applies on the small scale as well, with citizens groups and eventually citizens assemblies.